Hello, everyone. Pablo here from GoAlpha. Welcome to the 11th episode of Know Your MIP, the series where we go in depth on MIPs. We're back after the longest hiatus yet. And for this episode, we have Adrian, a DCP from Strategic Finance, with us. He's one of the authors of a recently ratified amendment that introduced big changes in MIP40, the MIP that defines how core unit budgets are to be handled. Know Your MIP calls are usually divided in a fuzzy way into sections, a presentation by MIP authors, and questions from the audience and discussion. This might or might not be the case today. We don't have a traditional presentation. Adrian instead is going to be walking us through the MIP and through the process of putting a budget together under the new framework. If you have questions before the presentation or during the presentation, please raise your hand or use the chat. Adrian, thank you for being here. I'm going to ask one single opening question that I think is useful for context. After that, it's all yours.
Okay.
So the question is, what was the motivation for this amendment?
Sure. So, sorry. Literally the worst. Like he's being a very naughty boy, I'm afraid. Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So this coincided, I think, with a period of. So let's take a quick step back. The whole concept of core units and Maker indeed being a profitable bank is actually relatively new. I think we lose sight of the fact that of how quickly this has happened. But if you look at the past performance, Maker as $1 billion business is maybe not even a year, right? So, and then the core unit's less than that even. So this whole core unit structure is very, very new, and we're sort of. It's clear that we have to learn as we go and make changes as the environment modifies and as the protocol itself evolves. One thing that you notice is that the process for approval of core unit budgets tends to lag the business results. So there was a period of an extraordinary amount of accumulation of surplus buffer, firstly at the beginning of 2021, but especially towards the end, which coincided with an all-time high for the price of ETH in dollars and so forth. Then the music changed, and then came a whole slate of core unit budget modification requests, probably anchored or indexed or working on sort of market environment that was in the process of turning. And I think a lot of the people in the forums, the delegates, they were complaining that they had to face a lot of budget modification requests. A lot of people faced, particularly for budget increases, there were a lot of questions regarding the motivation for these. And overall, I think the previous MIP40 process, while suitable for Maker in a smaller state, Maker had probably outgrown it because it provided perhaps too much openness and flexibility in what might constitute a budget request. So the motivation was to get something changed quickly that would basically try to summarize as many of the concerns that we could gather from the delegates that were asking questions on the forums. And also do it with the perspective of trying to help the person writing the MIP. Because if some of these, so there are a few scenarios where a MIP request sort of fails the protocol. One is where a budget request does not add value to the protocol and it gets approved. And the other one is where it does add value to the protocol and it does not get approved. So I think in trying to help the person who's formulating the budget request, hopefully we minimize these two types of error. And Maker governance cycles being what they are, now it's starting, right? So Maker governance approved of our proposal. It was enacted, and now we're entering a period where there will be what appear to be more requirements to people writing budgets. But in essence, hopefully, the idea is that it removes cognitive overhead for the person writing it to make things more obvious. And also aids in comparability and removes cognitive overheads for the delegates at the moment of reviewing. And last but not least, I think we've also added some requirements to take into consideration what happens in the event of an offboarding. So in here, we worked with Tim, Tim Gal and Limpa, who were reviewing the MIP for offboarding, following a chaotic core unit offboarding. I think asking budget proponents to take into consideration what might happen and what they would do in the event of an offboarding ahead of time is probably something good to ask of people. So yeah, I hope this answers the question. A bit long-winded, but I think this speaks to the motivation of changing this. And ultimately, the changes, there are not that many changes. We'll walk through some of the bigger ones. I think the introduction of a budget window is probably one of them, probably the biggest. But beyond that, fundamentally, the structure is essentially the same. All we're doing is adding a few requirements around the type of information that budget requests should have. Beyond that, it's almost exactly the same as before.
Cool. Yeah. So are you going to walk us through the amendment now, or are you going to put together a budget? Yes. What are you going to do exactly?
So a bit of both. I have a little thing. I'm going to share my screen. You're obviously also welcome to browse to the specific page. Here. To browse to the specific page if you if it's more comfortable for you. And the idea is that we walk through just quickly some of the top level changes. We stop at each point in case there are any questions. And there are two specific examples. Oh, here, I'll drag this one into the window. Yeah. There are two specific examples that we're going to walk through. One is for a new core unit. The other one is taking a real life example of the strategic finance core unit to look at the impact of this new template onto real life scenarios. If that's okay with people on the call. What do you guys think? Right?
Sounds good.
But I do want to make this, there's no point in doing a PowerPoint presentation about this. I feel like it's probably more worthwhile to go through it and have a live discussion. And more importantly, before I start, this is all just going to be quite intro, right? But if anyone in the core units or in delegates needs help reviewing a budget proposal or writing a budget proposal, writing a budget modification request, I think you should definitely not hesitate to send anyone in strategic finance a DM to schedule some time, because I think we'd be happy to sit down and help to the extent that we're able. So yeah. So MIP40, it's live on the MIPS portal. I think what we're going to do is sort of start going through some of the key changes and talk a little bit live. And here I encourage your engagement in case there are further questions or if there are any confusions. And apologies again for the dog in the background. It's quite bored. So we're going to walk through the main components of budget written under the MIP40 requirements. They are, to be specific, a budget term, a motivation, a roadmap, contingency planning, submission windows, a modification greater than 10%, and considerations in the event of an offboarding. So here, the first one is that we're trying to give a little bit more scope to what a budget constitutes, right? So there are MIP processes for enacting a core unit with a mandate, and then the budget should serve to bring to life that mandate with financial resources drawn from the DAO. To that extent, anything that's shorter than 3 months or longer than 12 months probably doesn't fit into this. I struggle to see what sort of budget should exist that's longer than 12 months. The overarching philosophy is that at the end of the day, we're trying to make things as permissionless as possible. And here, we're trying to make things as permissionless as possible. And ultimately, the objective of the DAO should eventually be to unwind itself and just make it run on its own. This may or may not be people's views, but I think having a budget, at the very least, having a budget reviewed once a year doesn't seem like too much of a bother for the workers, and it seems like a reasonable time frame under which to review the performance of a core unit. And anything shorter than that probably fits a different type of MIP proposal. Yeah, how do you guys feel about this? Surprising? Any changes? We're good. All right, here, so on the motivation, so moving on the motivation, we got a little bit of commentary on this, and I expect we'll probably have some questions oriented around this. So going back to the question of what is the purpose of a budget, right? Insofar as it should serve to help a core unit fulfill its mandate. On the one hand, whether a mandate is suitable or not for the DAO should be resolved in the MIP related to the mandate for that core unit. But whether or not the financial resources that are being planned to execute that mandate are suitable should be evaluated in the context of a budget request. So you can have a reasonable core unit with a good mandate, have an unreasonable budget that's not spent correctly. The overarching aim is to try to get people to think through in a return on investment, from a return on investment standpoint. We're trying to break it down in a very simplistic and reductive way in revenue growth, or the potential for a tangible improvement in efficiency. Now, it's obvious that all of the core units will fall in at least, yes, Tim.
Yeah, so since some folks on the call who were commenting on the forum aren't here, I'll take the point of information opposite side of that. I think operational efficiency, I think reductive is a great phrasing, but I think folks are a little nervous in any operational context to sort of show their work. So maybe now is not the right time to go through the example, but when we start to articulate an example of teams providing ROI, we can sort of talk about how reducing that term actually introduces more breadth for success, right? Because essentially if a core unit is defining what they see as success for operational efficiency, they would show it, right? But I think there's definitely some nervousness around that atmosphere. So if we can sort of unpack that a little, I think that would be super helpful for like the record or whatever you want to call this call.
Definitely. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, yeah, of course, there was some nervousness around this, oriented around the perception that a purely support function, I think mostly, honestly, oriented around a so-called support function and whether they would be able to demonstrate ROI, or whether ROI is the right metric, or, are some people delivering value even though you can't really quantify it. Here we're trying to draw a definitive line and say that, yes, support units can drive value. They do drive value. And this is the opportunity to, firstly, for the writer of the core unit budget proposal to reflect on how that value is brought to the DAO. And secondly, to also demonstrate that this budget will achieve that aim. And you can think of ancillary, non-related, whatever, let's have a core unit that bakes bread. Like, I'm sure it's nice, everyone likes bread, it's supporting everyone's morale, but it's not really directly related to the business of the DAO. And I think it's a very, if you take this reductive lens, you can very quickly see that maybe a bakery core unit is not the most suitable. So yeah, sorry to break it. I mean, maybe it is.
A more specific example that would actually work is like grants, right? So grants are one of those things where you're extending funds in the hope that people come back and return something. But life happens, things go south. And so realistically, did this improve operational efficiency is quite fuzzy. And luckily we've seen some other DAOs, like Optimism comes to mind, where the impact is more important than like the direct hard numbers of it. But I just think opening that conversation is important to actually say to ourselves in some like cultural capacity, even if it is just this 15 people in an echo chamber here, that not everything is like hard numbers. You opened a vault because this grant went to the bakery or whatever. So
and I mean, these are conversations so what we noticed was that these conversations were taking place anyway in the forums. And often when when a request did not have an explicit link to the activity of the DAO, to how it was supporting the DAO, the value that it was bringing, it just created more rancor, even though the value was probably there. And and it's not necessarily limited to operational efficiency, right? So potential for revenue growth. If you think of the events core unit, for example, it's clearly mostly linked to the potential for revenue growth, but it's very second order. So, in the event of if they want to do more events, they're going to have to show that doing more events will eventually result in the potential for revenue. But at least it's related. So you can sort of see that, yes, having a DAI event will eventually, eventually someone may use DAI because they went to a DAI event, right? Or they went to a hackathon that was sponsored by Maker or something. So yeah, I think here, I don't know if I should jump to examples or.
Just want to pipe in. John Perry here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the facilitator for events. So yeah, great. You're actually like talking and bringing this up because that's been one of the questions when I've been looking at this new MIP with that section saying you got to demonstrate actual financial benchmarks or value. Events, yeah. It's not one of those things. It's more of a PR type thing. We can kind of say people came out, we attracted talent towards a DAO, attract attention, maybe some vaults were open. Can I go after and say, oh, this person was there and because they exactly attended, they opened a vault? Not sure that's even going to be possible, but like it's their PR function. So the ROI is maybe not a direct financial thing. There's ROIs that aren't financial with it.
No, for sure. And especially with these sort of second order value core units, I think this is, but you see how I think so events is a great example because it's one that clearly does increase the potential for revenue growth, but it just doesn't do it in a directly measurable way, as might a core unit that's dedicated to whatever growth, right? They're measured on or are focused purely on driving revenue growth. So yeah, I think hopefully, asking budget request formulators to at the very least make this statement of link towards the potential for value accretion to the DAO helps both the person who's submitting it and the delegate at the time of reviewing it. And it's clear that it's not going to be, a percentage, right? Every time. Well, maybe in any case, it'll be near impossible to demonstrate a percentage number. But what we're aiming to do here is really tie. And so one thing is on the mandate of the core unit, and the other thing is on the way that core unit is planning to spend those funds, right? So in the case of the events example, I think one thing that was strong from their budget request, outside of the mandate, which should probably be left to the discussion on whether the events core unit mandate is suitable for the DAO. When it comes to the spending of the core unit or how that spending is planned, I think what John did quite well was to show like, look, these are the benchmarks. This is how we think we should spend it. We have experience doing blah, blah, blah. This is the right way to do it, and, some people chimed in and said like, hey, why don't you do partnerships? And it was like, yeah, that's a great build. Like, let's talk about partnerships and see how we can minimize the spend and therefore implicitly increase the ROI, right? And I think that's an example of a very successful back and forth discussion about the uses of the funds. I think having this upfront should hopefully stimulate more of those and less of the sort of rancorous, oh, you're overspending on blah, 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 like,
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, the intent is, so yeah, fully aligned. Like it may never be a pure percentage number, but if you find a way to tie it to how successfully you're going to invest those funds to execute the mandate of your core unit and tie those to the value results of that, I think it'll be just easier for everyone.
Yeah, just to echo that point and speak to a specific as a delegate from that perspective, part of the reason events actually provides value is by reducing the work of other people who want to put those on in the first place, right? Which means they're taking money from their salaries or their units, or they're looking for funds in that way. When realistically speaking, professionals who run AV events should probably be the team running those things, right? Regardless of whether we should be doing it in the first place, which is a whole separate thing that's on the mandate. That's just one example. That's why I wanted to unpack it. So this is great that this came up. Thank you.
Yeah, also,
sorry.
Oh yeah, I just would add, as I think about events, other core units in other parts of the DAO are going to be able to take advantage of that work if they show up to the events and are able to build relationships, have conversations. And so one thing for events, John, I wouldn't leave that out either, which is like, that's going to be very hard to follow and demonstrate, like kind of the value that other core units or other parts of the DAO are able to extract for their own mandates because you had an event and maybe they attended, or there was a awareness brought that helps everyone execute on what's on their plate.
Yeah, exactly. And that's always something, it's a great point. Like, it's like the ROI that isn't the financial value. There's that exists with events, just to bring either awareness or the connections that we might not even realize. That's super hard for us to track. I'm trying to think of ways to kind of benchmark goals or results of events, but it's super hard because people are chatting and something happens and we just don't even know about it, which is great, but yeah.
Clear. And yeah, I think just a thought for, like Peyton, so to touch on Peyton's point in the chat, if you start from a small business, it's almost, so there's a way of thinking about support functions in relation to the size of business and the point at which it's more economical to bring a function in-house than it is to contract the service provider for it. And I think Maker is starting to grow to a size where many functions can be reliably and demonstrably profitably brought in-house versus just farming them out to an outside person. A simplistic and stupid case, but protocol engineering. You could say they derive revenue, but obviously it's more, if we take the sort of operational lens, it's obviously much more profitable for Maker to have an onboard team of developers than it is to subcontract them through an agency or whatever, which might be more suitable if Maker were 1/100th of the size. I think you could take this lens to many of the so-called support functions and very quickly see that, yes, there's actually a demonstrable reduction in sort of opportunity costs from consuming resources that are tied up doing other things. And then just pure service efficiency, like number of hours times the rate for having an in-house person is just less than having it outside of the DAO. Yeah. So there was a bit of back and forth on this, and I think hopefully a lot of the nervousness dissipated. I'd like to sort of again restate, to the extent that any writer of a core unit budget proposal or modification request wants to even just sound off ideas, and we've had a few of these conversations with different facilitators from core units that were like, hey, how does this sound? Because they started, on the back of the budget request runs that happened in sort of February and March, they started proactively thinking about, hey, how do we frame our value proposition to the DAO? They were eager to sort of go through the specific examples and just talk over those. And what I found actually was that there was very little input that the strategic finance team could have, because they had just thought about it very carefully and very systematically. And I think that's the aim, to show that thinking. Yeah. Roadmap and objectives, I think, is quite linked. It'll obviously be linked to the investments and the timing of those investments. Realistically, most of the investments of the DAO are going to be in just plain contractor costs, right? In sort of salaries and headcount expenses. Other than like events, strategic happiness, maybe branding, a handful of other core units, most of it is just going to be in people. And then the roadmap and objectives will just try to set a deadline for accountability purposes, but also to explain that, hey, look, if you invest in 12 months of people, at the end, you're going to get X. And then, of course, things might derail, things might go faster or slower, but at the very least, you have a benchmark to have that discussion with at the end of the budget term, when it's time to renew or stop and move on, or increase or decrease, or whatever the case may be. Having a sort of clear roadmap, I think, is quite important to this effect. And contingency planning is another new thing that we introduced, because there was a lot of discussion on those sort of first quarter budget requests related to people starting to get nervous about the market turning and seeing budget increases, probably related to the sort of lag effect that I discussed earlier. And here we're asking people to be just proactive, and related to this contingency planning, as part of the structure of the MIP, what we've done is we've introduced this concept of a ranked voting, thanks to GovAlpha for sort of setting it up correctly. But if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that the proposal parameters are no longer oriented on a binary sort of yes and no. You're making me nervous with the crossed fingers, Peyton. But but the idea is that at the moment of voting, you won't be constrained to a binary choice of accept an all-in increased budget or reject, which implicitly offboards a core unit and may not be the desired outcome. But here it basically allows governance to decide, like, look, this core unit is doing the right work, but I actually think the bear case that they're showing is probably more relevant. So, we're going to go ahead and approve them, but just with the existing budget. And they should be able to fulfill the existing mandate with the existing or reduced budget. On the other hand, it may well be the case that the results have been good, and there's good momentum, so it's worth approving an increased budget. So fingers crossed also, but the idea is that these should work, and having them in a stacked ranking order should allow a bit more granularity on the decision making from the delegate point of view, where often the comment from the delegate was, I like the work you're doing, I just don't believe you need 5 new people to do it.
I guess, could I ask a question there?
Yeah.
Wondering if you have any recommendations in terms of planning, right? Because obviously this is an advantage to not have it be all or nothing. But if you're kind of forward looking, right, and you end up not getting your budget increase approved, like, just looking for best practices for facilitators to plan for that potential reality.
Sure. So in the instance of, in our own case in strategic finance, we had a budget. We have a budget request with an increase, quite a significant one, around 40%, that we released to government. And we could tie this increase in the budget to just hiring new people, right? We know in the past few months of working that we're stretched on capacity and bandwidth here and there, and having additional resources would help us fulfill our mandate, notably in like accounting or whatever. In our thinking around that planning is purely related. So strategic finance is a core unit that almost all of the expenses are related to the people, and there's some ancillary sort of software services and things like this. So I think having that, it's easier for us maybe because we know that by delaying the hiring, we can essentially create a lower budget, knowing that it will just mean that we'll just need to work, more hours, extra hard. Things will take longer. The budget, the double entry accounting project that we're working on will just take longer. And I think communicating this upfront through the budget request is just helpful to show, because it's a dispassionate decision, right? It's up to governance to decide, do you want to invest? Do you believe that the value of having one additional accounting person is worth the incremental expense? If not, then this is the outcome. But it's more, I think starting from the business planning and then working towards the impact on the budget is probably how you would be able to see this. And then in the case of like a contingency and bear and downside scenarios, you just have to be quite ruthless and look at where you can cut the most, or where you can cut first. For us, it's, for example, our own comp. For us, it's software services that it'll take us longer to do without them, but we can eventually still get things done. So again, it's going back to this point on planning on what the business would look like if you had just less resources, and then trying to work from there and seeing what the impact would be. And there's some people, if I remember well, I think there was a discussion around, but this will just mean that people will pad the budget. But hopefully the idea is that if you do try and game the system and pad the budget and have a bear case that's really nice, and then stack on top of that, it should become obvious to the delegates and to the governance reviewing it that, hold up, maybe you don't need this much money for your aims, right? Like, or conversely, if they do believe the story, then you're tied to those results. Like, maybe you weren't expecting to have that budget increase approved, and now you have to deliver against it. And if you don't, then you're held to those results. Hopefully there should be a natural alignment of incentives that promotes, just honest business planning, honest budget planning, and a governance process that has a honest and cold dialogue. So much on contingency. And this, I think, also related is the modification. So here, it's obviously quite jarring when you see a budget request that has a very large increase in budget when the market is turning and the price of maker is collapsing. I think unrelated to this, I think any sort of substantial increase in fixed costs probably should have a variance analysis of where those changes come from, right? So you explain that this cost is tied to having X new people. This cost is tied to having new computers. And again, the intent here is to just facilitate the conversation between governance and the core unit budget proposer. It's like, do you really need these people, or could you use more people, right? I think having this as a requirement should hopefully force this thinking at the moment of business planning and avoid the need for a useless back and forth at the time of governance. And no, that's not the one here. So we had made actually a fake MIP for a new budget for a prop desk, the HFT 001. And then here, I think what we tried to do, so here's an example of the headcount planning that we tried to do and tie to the timings. So we're clearly showing in this request when we want to hire these FTEs, by when we expect to have the respective burn rate. And then based on this business planning, you can sort of back calculate what a bear or super bear planning might look like. And with the corresponding impact, right? Like, you can just clearly say, like, look, we can do X, but if we just have fewer computers, we'll just do less of X, or slower, or what have you.
Adrian, I think we skipped reporting and transparency there.
Right. So yes, so the reporting and transparency, I don't think this changes very much from the previous budget format, other than the ask to disclose full-time equivalent headcount by month. I think most core unit budgets have an implied, have an associated full-time equivalent headcount budget. But I think just displaying that would be helpful to see what the intended spend is, when it's intended to ramp up, what those headcounts are supposed to do. I would say that's the biggest change. Then we're asking, people to tie things to a chart of accounts that's standardized, so that then, delegates can take, if they get 5 budget requests, they can take each of the 5, they have the same format, they have the same rows, they can just put them side by side, and they can look at, okay, such and such is spending this much, and this is what the headcount cost is, and this is their hardware. And I think there were a lot of comments from delegates regarding the inability to do a comparison. Now, it's obvious that some core units won't necessarily have exactly these charts of accounts, and there's no hard requirement to stick to these. I think events is another great example, right? So, there are some expenses in events that don't happen in any other core unit. So obviously they need to be called out separately, and they'll have their own category, but that's events, so it's sort of understood. I think most other core units could basically be summarized in this chart of accounts, which is essentially that of a service business, I guess. like a people-driven business. Then the submission windows, I think, was another, So the submission period was another source of a lot of back and forth on the RFC. In the end, we asked for a lot of opinions, and in the end, we defaulted to the delegate view, which was that they don't want to see 10 budget requests every month. And what this in practice does is just force a little bit more planning, and it's related to the fact that a budget can have a minimum of a 3-month window for operations. So, you know, at the expense of the loss of some perceived flexibility, it just makes the life of a delegate a lot easier to know that, okay, the March cycle is when I'm going to review 50 budget requests, and it's done, and that's it. It also said, yes, it's known upfront, and it ties to every other sort of characteristic of the budget request. Here, I think the core units wanted more flexibility, the delegates wanted more windows. So we opted, at the end of the day, it's the delegates who make most of the governance decisions. So, yeah.
I'll also chime in on behalf of maker holders as well. Like, you know, the eventual hope of governance isn't that it's just delegates doing all this, right? It's that casual MKR holders come in and they choose to participate as well. So if it's in like a known window in a cycle that's easier to jump onto, I think it just adds more clarity. So
yeah, like Tadeo says, in the worst case, you wait like 2 months, right? And honestly, given the structural liabilities that core unit expenses represent to Maker, so we're a protocol that is priced in DAI, highly correlated to the price of ETH, and all of our fixed costs are in DAI. To the extent that we can avoid just jumping on them, like if ETH rallies to 6,000 for a month, and then the following month you see a rash of core unit expense, core unit budget requests, I think this budget window introduces a cooling off period that allows for this lag effect to sort of settle down and really have a think through of what the planning process should be for the activities of that CU. Similar, you could say that similar on the downside, if ETH dumps to 500 and, you know, there's a new core unit that can help fix it or something, it also allows them to sort of cool off period, see what the environment really is like, and then design for that instead of just planning haphazardly throughout the year. Yeah, surprisingly, not a lot of comments. What do the delegates think about this? Gianga, how do you feel about 4 times a year reviewing 50 budget requests?
Fabulous. Feel wonderful. No, I'm happy with this result.
Yeah, I think it was mostly core unit versus delegate, but honestly, it wasn't that strong either. So, Tadeo, you want to say something?
Hey, there we go. It works. Yeah. Hey. So just to work on this, let's say, so my current budget finishes on April. So I mean, that means that in a normal situation, I would be preparing my new budget in February. I would be submitting at the start of March. March would be the frozen, the request for comment. At the end of it gets frozen, and then it finally gets voted in April, and then finally gets executed at the start of May. So with this new window change, that means I'm not following if I need to push it back a month, right? I need to start a month earlier so I can push my vote rather than April or in March.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Right?
Or you roll the dice, cut your spending, and do it in the following governance window. But I don't know if you have enough budget for that. But that would basically mean you risk
isn't that a little bit like, yeah, it's a little bit like misappropriation of funds. Like my mandate finishes on May. Like whether I have extra money or not, I shouldn't go past May without a new mandate and budget approved, I think.
No, and that brings me to another point. Yeah, I'll jump into after. But yeah, basically it just means that now that you know what the budget windows are, you just need to plan backwards from when your current budget term finishes. you would expect that from there, I mean, it may not even change year on year, right? Like, so if you roll your budget for like on a 12-month basis, just every year you're going to have to do it in January. Prepare it in January, send it to the forum in February, and go through the governance process in March. For sort of implementation at the beginning of May, right? Unless you have a budget term that's like 1 month shorter, and then it realigns with everything, but it doesn't have to.
I could technically reduce even more, just cut it short, just so if I want to reset a specific month.
Potentially, yes.
Going back to the windows, I feel like this, like if the problem was that we had too many budgets ongoing at the same time, wouldn't the windows make it worse? Because again, it's not like we're gonna have, here we're assuming that we're gonna have the same amount of core units, let's say.
Yeah.
I wasn't assuming that. Yeah, I mean, from a delegate's perspective, not myself, I don't hold this opinion, but some of the other ones I've heard, I'll keep that anonymous. They feel as though all they're seeing is new ad hoc budgets that just keep increasing. I don't share that view personally, because I think we're improving the system over time. That's my own personal opinion. But putting them into a window does create a bottleneck, but with a standardized process behind it, then it actually is a little bit easier to go through them all and not one-to-one compare them, but have like a framework to work through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I
also, that makes sense.
Go, Kianga, go.
Yeah, just like focusing, so the shifting gears. It's so much easier to like, okay, even if it's intense volume, it's like, this is all I'm doing, and I'm getting in this headspace. And then it's over for, a quarter, and then get back into that intense mode, then having to kind of like, it just kind of popping up asynchronous, just sort of all the time continuously, is much more difficult to manage. So I prefer, I work better that way if I can take the pain all at once and be more efficient. Like that's a form of efficiency, because it takes a while then to get back into that mental batching, like that mental framework. So yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
That's the delegate view. And I think also just from a structural planning perspective, coming back again to this point of the fixed costs, it also allows you to evaluate what the impact of all of these new budget requests, or any of the budget requests that governance decides to approve, will be on Maker. And it just makes things a bit more predictable and easier to manage, rather than having them, protocol engineering 1 month, then the whatever fixed cost one the next month, and then it's just much harder to go through a planning for the protocol as a whole. That's my view anyway. I tend to share the delegate view in this instance. I can see how it's annoying because for the core unit, because it's, you have to just time your request, but you have to time your request anyway for governance, right? You have the submission windows, you have the things, the days, the dates. So all that means is that you do it in January instead of February.
Yeah, no, just a finishing comment on this is that from the core unit perspective, at least my previous experience, I think we passed the budget, I think it was March. It felt like because there were a lot of other core units asking for a budget, that no one was paying attention to us until after the frozen period. And then they were like, oh yeah, by the way, we got to look at data insights. Here, I would expect that if we don't have windows and let's say we have 2 budgets per month, then there's more time allocated to, let's say in my scenario where we do have a discussion during the request for comments section, rather than be left out by the end. Because at the end, maybe I'm wrong, but at the end we still have more or less the same amount of non-budget related votes happening every single month. So it simply means that we're just pushing out certain budgets into a specific window, maybe leaving, let's say April, quite like a relaxed month, but then March itself has normal votes plus all the additional budget votes.
I'm also thinking the new portal or dashboard that we just got a wonderful demo about, when that goes live, I think that'll be a huge help in from a review perspective, kind of having a better view over a consistent period of time. And so when it comes time to review the budgets, we're all more literate and have fewer questions that could, overshadow, to your point, the attention that everyone really deserves in the debate period.
To be, okay, so 2 points there. The first one is, I hear you on the signal to noise for teams, right? This happens in every grouping of people. I'm not going to say organization because DAOs are fuzzy, but realistically speaking, once you have about 100 full-time equivalent people working at something, you need to build better systems, right? And so this might be the opportunity to sort of, I guess, recommend some of the conversations that have been happening around clustering. So having maybe a couple of delegates that are there, but it's also an opportunity to be proactive as a core unit and say, hey, we haven't gotten enough comments. I'm just going to go and ask people in public channels if they want to take some time to come and talk through the budget to see if there's anything we're missing. The other point is from the voting perspective, there's been a lot of instances of people offering comments, those comments being softly absorbed, and then the vote proceeding anyway. So like the ability to actually really have the feedback integrated comes at this point where you basically have to either rubber stamp something or just say no, which leads to kind of a rock and a hard place for any MKR holder or delegate, right? So it's a bit of a two things at once, but some possible solutions are definitely adding in extra time and then specifically seeking advice to get that review. Because yeah, it's as someone who's got a MIP amendment up, not having feedback is kind of the worst place to be. So I hear all those concerns.
Yeah, I want to co-sign. I always am pleased to get a mention in a post, like at recognized delegate, or because there's so much flow. So no one should feel shy, from my perspective, about tagging myself, or I can't speak obviously for all the delegates, but so far, I don't want to like open up a can of worms here, but so far I found it helpful when different core unit leads have pinged us, and sometimes I think that happens from Gov Alpha as well when there hasn't been a lot of feedback. I find it helpful.
Sorry, I want to mention that we're reaching the top of the hour. I don't know if you guys have the energy to extend this into a long Know Your MIP session, or if it's a better idea to have a second part of this. I don't know how you guys feel about this.
I'm available for everyone, but more importantly, I'm available off the call as well, right? One-to-one. I think this is where I can maybe be of more use for specific questions or anything. Before we go, I did want to jump on a point that Tadeo alluded to. So hopefully, Tadeo, at the time of the next cycle, we're able to, we'll see how it goes, At the we also have to improve things incrementally. And at the time of the next budget window, I think your point is a very good one. Kiang and Tim have made some good comments. Hopefully the batching of core unit and budget requests will allow them to really focus on the budget requests and to drive through them and address them with comments and feedback and what have you. If they don't, then that we'll problem solve at that point. What else? The return of funds here. So window, I mean, it's literally anytime. There's no, I think we have office hours, but we function much more informally. So just ping us whenever on Discord and we'll set up a quick call. There's no, we're quite relaxed. Yes, so final point on the return of funds. We've also introduced a requirement to return funds. In most instances, we can give the benefit of the doubt and assume that everyone is a good faith actor. The return of funds is more of a balance sheet management decision than it is a sort of formal oversight. Than it is a sort of formal oversight of whipping the core units. Core units that have lumpy expenses with a predictable timing can obviously say and not return the funds because they clearly need the funds at a specific time and beyond the threshold of these sort of 3 months. But internally in strategic finance, we're calling this part of our equity, and it is part of our equity. It's part of the operating reserves that sit on core unit wallets. And to the extent that they're not productive, they should be returned to the surplus buffer. This MIP introduces that requirement. That's it. I mean, obviously, yeah, it's hard to police, right? So we can't go around people's houses and signing transactions, but at the very least, having this requirement will create the contra example when a core unit doesn't or forgets or what have you.
Cool. Thank you, Adrian. We are 3 minutes away from the top of the hour. If people feel this was valuable and are interested in a second part to this Know Your MIP, we can organize that. But for the moment, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank you, Adrian, for the walkthrough. And please, let's keep the discussion going in the forum, particularly in this thread that I'm going to share here. And before closing, let me remind you that we're having another Know Your MIP number 12 with Tim Black on Tuesday 14th at 17 UTC, I think. It's going to be about the core unit offboarding process amendment.
Yep, that's great.
Yep, so thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks so much. Be in touch on the forums and on Discord.
Happy weekend, everyone.
Have a nice weekend.
Happy weekend.